The foundations of modern microeconomics were established in the 1870s. The ideal economy was comprised of a large number of small firms that lacked sufficient power to significantly affect market outcomes. Firms maximized profits and consumers maximized utility. The reality of the 19th century, though, was very different. Competition was fierce. Technological advancements made large-scale production profitable. Large firms used cost advantages to undersell competitors, driving smaller firms out of business. Industrial leaders like John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan entered into various forms of combinations, trust, and mergers in an effort to monopolize industries. The result was an increasing concentration of wealth and power, and the creation of a group of wealthy businessmen that came to be known as the robber barons. But the days of the robber barons were short-lived. The public did not appreciate their abuses of power, which included price fixing, bribing politicians, charging exorbitant prices, underselling competitors to bankrupt them, and manipulating stock prices. The public response was overwhelming, and there was a demand for government action. In this segment, we examine the government's effort to restrain the power of monopolies. That effort largely takes the form of antitrust legislation and regulation. This, however, raises a number of questions. How did the antitrust movement originate? What did the antitrust movement try to accomplish? How does government measure monopoly power? Why would government regulate monopolies instead of break them up? Is regulation effective? Is there a justification for monopoly? And how does sheer size give business an advantage? Competition, as we've seen, weeds out inefficient firms and pressures others to reduce costs. But this only happens in a system with many small firms, none of which dominate the market. The competition that followed the Civil War, however, differed from our textbook definition. Competition during this period was brutal, leading to increasing concentration within and between industries. During periods of economic boom and bust, smaller, weaker firms are driven out of business, and that leaves fewer, richer firms that have become larger. As competition became increasingly cutthroat, many of the more successful businesses sought to avoid competition by merging with others. But the merger movement itself resulted from a combination of factors. First, new technologies introduced economies of scale, enabling firms to reduce costs. From 1870 to 1900, for example, productivity in steel production more than doubled. The time involved in transporting oil from Cleveland to New York fell from 30 days to 10 days. Similar cost savings occurred in virtually every industry. Second, firms engaged in cutthroat competition. When demand fell, businesses responded by cutting prices, even if those prices were below costs. Most witnesses appearing in hearings before the Industrial Commission in 1899 commented that competition was so vigorous the profits of nearly all competing establishments were destroyed. The problem reflected the attitudes of many industrial leaders. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who made a fortune in shipping, wrote a letter to his business associates. "Gentlemen," he said, "you have undertaken to ruin me. I will not sue you, for law takes too long. I will ruin you." And J.P. Morgan, in response to a legal warning from an associate, quipped, "I don't know what I want a lawyer to tell me what I cannot do. I hire him to tell me how to do what I want to do." Third, the late 19th century witnessed the emergence of a new form of business enterprise called the trust, which soon evolved into the corporation. A trust is an arrangement among shareholders of independent firms to give up control of their stock in exchange for certificates entitling them to a share of common profits arising from the trust. So a group of trustees would operate the firms as a monopoly, controlling output and setting price. The corporation became the preferred form of business enterprise when New Jersey changed the law allowing one corporation to own the stock of another. Corporations could also issue stock which enabled them to finance large-scale investments. Now, the search for some sort of means to discipline competition led to various schemes for establishing combinations, mergers, and cartels. This was largely the result of improved mass production technologies, expanding transportation networks, and the boom-bust nature of the economy. Mass-scale production led in many cases to economies of scale, making large firms more cost-efficient. Expanding transportation networks increased the overall market size, and the boom-bust cycle led to periods of intense competition followed by rapid growth. During economic downturns, smaller, inefficient firms were driven out of business, while during boom periods, remaining firms increased the scale of their production. By the late 1880s, certain businesses, including Standard Oil Company and U.S. Steel, had become virtual monopolies, enabling them to set prices and restrain competition. The public demanded regulation. In 1890, the government responded. First, the government established the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate trade between the states. And second, the government passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. It stated that every contract, combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy in restraint of trade or commerce among the several states or with foreign nations is hereby declared to be illegal. It goes on to say that every person who shall monopolize or attempt to monopolize or combine or conspire with any other person or persons to monopolize any part of trade or commerce among the several states or with foreign nations shall be deemed guilty. The antitrust laws were an effort to eliminate monopoly power and cutthroat competition. Their ideological underpinning is the perfectly competitive model in which firms compete on the basis of price. The Sherman Act was the first used to break up the Standard Oil Company and the American Tobacco Company on the pretext that these firms engaged in predatory pricing, that is, pricing their products below the prices of their competitors. By 1904, one or two giant firms controlled at least half the output in 78 different industries. Standard Oil, under John D. Rockefeller, owned over 80% of the nation's refining capacity. An American Tobacco Company controlled about 80% of tobacco products. But in the same decision that broke up these two firms, the court opened up a principle that allowed businesses to exist as monopolies. That principle is called the rule of reason. The court interpreted the Sherman Antitrust Law as outlawing practices that restrain trade. However, a corporation could exist as a monopoly if it used reasonable tactics. Of course, what reasonable meant was ambiguous, so Congress passed the Clayton Act and the Federal Trade Commission Act in 1914 to help clarify things. The Clayton Act offered more specific antitrust guidelines which outlined predatory pricing, tying contracts, price discriminations, and mergers which would substantially limit competition or create a monopoly. The Federal Trade Commission Act created an agency to review unfair competitive practices. A few years later, a suit was brought against U.S. Steel. J.P. Morgan gained control of the industry, which included 156 major factories and the capacity of 2/3 of the nation's steel casting and ingots. But unlike Standard Oil, no one testified against U.S. Steel. So, without witnesses and basing its case on the rule of reason, the court ruled in favor of U.S. Steel, and so there was no need to break it up. Over the years, though, another principle emerged as a basis for breaking up monopolies, the per se rule. The per se rule states that the existence of monopoly alone is sufficient reason to break it up. In 1945, the per se rule was applied to Alcoa Aluminum. Alcoa controlled 90% of the aluminum processing in the U.S. It did not engage in unreasonable practices, and it kept its price low, which benefited society. But this discouraged entrants. Although the court agreed that Alcoa had been a good citizen, the judge ruled that its very existence constituted sufficient reason to break it up. Now, instead of breaking up Alcoa, the government sold war plants at bargain prices to Reynolds Aluminum and Kaiser Aluminum. Later, the government subsidized 3 other entrants in the aluminum industry. The goal of antitrust policy is to diffuse market power. But what exactly is market power, and how do we measure it? One answer is that market share is an important indicator of market power. However, some industries contain large firms which are highly competitive with each other. The existence of industry economies of scale may simply mean that large firms are necessary for competitiveness while still allowing for competition between giants. One of the most common indexes for measuring market power and the degree of concentration in an industry is the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. This index takes the market share of a firm and squares it. To determine the degree of concentration in an industry, the index sums squares of the market share for each firm. The industry with the highest number has the greatest degree of concentration, and those with the lowest numbers have the lowest degrees of concentration. Another method of measuring market power is to calculate concentration ratios within industries. A concentration ratio indicates the percent of market sales obtained by the 4, 8, and 20 largest firms in the industry. For example, in this table we see the concentration ratios for motor vehicles, electronics, aircraft, and pharmaceuticals. With motor vehicles, there are 284 total firms. Of those, the top 4 account for 92% of sales, the CR4 ratio. In electronics, the top 4 firms account for 42% of sales. On the bottom row, we see the pharmaceutical industry. The top 4 firms account for 26% of sales, the top 8 firms 42%, and the top 20 60% of sales. This number of top firms is usually set at either 4 or 8, and that corresponds to a CR4 or CR8 ratio. A high percentage indicates a concentrated industry. Concentration ratios have remained relatively steady across industries since the 1930s. Now, even concentration ratios fail to display an accurate picture. The past 40 years has seen the rapid expansion of multinational conglomerates across industries. Now, even with individual industry concentration ratios stable, a few large corporations have gained an increasing control over U.S. manufacturing assets. In fact, 88% of all manufacturing assets are owned by the 200 largest corporations. Now, many of these corporations have incomes that exceed that of most countries.
Isn't it time for Baywatch yet?
Despite our discussion of the evolution of antitrust, there are situations when monopolies make sense. For example, local communities may be best served by one company distributing electricity. It is not in society's interest to duplicate transmission lines, so regulation serves as an alternative to breaking up monopolies. The justification for regulating monopolies rests on the social interest theory of regulation. The idea is straightforward. Monopolies are regulated because unregulated monopolies do not serve the social interest. Their size gives them sufficient power such that maximizing profits does not maximize social welfare. The invisible hand model of welfare breaks down because these sorts of large firms are no longer subject to the discipline of the market. The firms themselves set the rules. Remember that monopolies are defined as a single seller of a good for which there are no close substitutes. Since the monopolist is a profit-maximizing firm, the monopolist sets price at that point on the demand curve that's above where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Since price exceeds marginal cost, social welfare is not maximized. And because of barriers to entry, the firm's high economic profits are protected. In an effort to keep monopolists from charging prices that are too high, many economists recommend regulation. But how should the monopolists be regulated, and what price should they sell their product?
It's very popular in society to glorify free enterprise and laissez-faire as the best distribution of resources, the best system for distribution of resources in the history of the world. And I would have to agree with that. But I think there's a certain element that we need to take into consideration, and that is that free enterprise and the profit system is as much made, is as much developed by consuming other businesses and actually eliminating, gobbling up competition as it is in selling more product to the consumer, offering a better service at a better price. If you can eliminate your competition, then you can do whatever you want and you can charge whatever you want for it. So it's a very good profit-making strategy. And as a result, it's very important, in my opinion, that we have a system of referees, of umpires, so to speak, and that's government. Government has to mediate, government has to regulate, government has to watch to make sure that the playing field is in fact level. Because if left to laissez-faire and free enterprise, it won't be. It doesn't work that way. The profit-making strategy is too strong of a motivational factor in companies. So you want to get rid of your competition, you want to downsize, you want to release 50-year-old executives onto the street with no place to go after they've spent 30 years with your company. So as a result of that, it doesn't really help society not to have a regulator. I kind of look at it as being an umpire or a referee of a basketball game. They don't always make the right calls. In fact, quite frequently they make the wrong calls. And unfortunately, that makes them the villain, even though they're a very important part of the game. The game couldn't exist without them. Government's very much the same way. But we also don't, in advertising and public relations, we don't glorify the referees. In fact, the only time you've even seen one on television lately, it's been Dennis Hopper in some crazed maniacal form, where even he is, as a referee or as an official, is glorifying the villainous play of some of the great athletes of our time. So you'll never see the referee on basketball cards, or you'll never see umpires on baseball cards. They'll never release a shoe that will allow an umpire or a referee to greater perform his or her duties in the completion of that role. And as a result, we forget about them, we vilify them, they become the object of our animosity, especially when they do something against our particular team. But to deny the fact that they're required for the effective play of the game is absurd, is juvenile, it's totally ridiculous. You can't have it without them.
There are different approaches to setting the regulatory price. First, remember that welfare is maximized when price equals marginal cost. This is where the benefit to society of producing one more unit just equals the cost to society of making it. This occurs in this diagram where quantity is at Q sub MC. There is, however, a problem. Note that the monopolist is characterized by economies of scale. The long-run average total cost curve declines as output increases. So we see that marginal cost is always below average total cost in this relevant area. To make the monopolist charge a price equal to marginal cost results in the monopoly making a loss. Society could subsidize the monopolist, but subsidies, especially to monopolists, are politically unpopular. The second approach to regulating price is to set it equal to average total cost. In this case, quantity would be a little less than before, but more than where the monopolist would like to produce. Price still exceeds marginal cost, so this solution does not maximize social welfare either. But the solution has its advantages. First, it involves no subsidies. Second, the price ensures a normal rate of return, or what the firm would earn if it were in a competitive situation. And third, price is substantially below the market price. The purpose of regulation is to protect society from large corporations. It is to make them do that which is in society's interest. Some economists, though, have questioned whether this is true. Their views are expressed in two other theories of regulation, the capture hypothesis and share the gain, share the pain theory. The capture hypothesis is that regulation serves the interest of those regulated. In effect, the regulated capture the regulators. Regulation no longer serves the interests of society, but the interests of the corporation. If this sounds crazy, remember the airline industry did not want to be deregulated in the 1970s. Why? Because regulation served to maintain high prices for the corporations. Well, the same thing applied in the trucking industry. And of course, those who serve as the regulators frequently leave government and work for the businesses they regulated, but at much higher salaries. The share the gain, share the pain theory of government regulation is that regulation serves the regulators. It is in the regulator's interest to see to it that regulations continue. Here's how it works. You create an agency or a bureaucracy in order to address a particular problem. Over time, the problem goes away, but the agency remains. So how do you get rid of an agency once the problem no longer exists? The problem, of course, is that the regulators are not immune from outside pressure. Ultimately, they must answer to legislatures, businesses, and consumers. Regulators who understand this make an effort to balance the various interests. The idea is to share the gain and share the pain. That way, no one gets sufficiently upset, and the regulation can continue. Increasingly, however, the government has reduced or eliminated regulation. In the late 1970s, under the Carter administration, government deregulated transportation, railroads, trucking, and the airlines. Ronald Reagan took this one step further. Running against the welfare state, Reagan asserted the problem with America was too much government. The solution? Cut taxes, reduce expenditures, and eliminate regulations. Since there's no question that regulation costs society and businesses resources, the real issue is whether the benefits of regulation are worth the costs.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt this program to bring you important news.
We've talked about the reasons for regulating monopolies or breaking them up. Unfair and deceptive practices get in the way of consumers' abilities to make informed decisions. Collusions by firms allows them to operate as a monopoly with the requisite loss in welfare. Highly concentrated industries may be less competitive and innovating than less concentrated ones. Monopoly power is the power to fix prices, collude, and engage in deceptive advertising. But not every economist agrees that monopoly is a bad thing. Joseph Schumpeter believed that monopoly profits are simply the return for successful innovation. So to deny the monopolist his or her reward is unfair and contrary to the social interest. Schumpeter argued that even the monopolist is not immune from competitive forces. His position regarding monopolies reflects a special view of the entrepreneur. An entrepreneur is one who introduces innovations. The entrepreneur creates new products, develops new markets, implements new productive techniques, and introduces new forms of industrial organization. And innovation initiates a process of industrial mutation that revolutionizes the economic structure from within, destroying the old one and creating a new one. This process is called creative destruction and is an essential feature of capitalism. The development and introduction of innovations ultimately depends on the entrepreneur's freedom to earn profits. Economic freedom is the basis for competition and the vehicle for dynamic change. Schumpeter's conception of competition is dynamic. Even the monopolist, whose excess profits represent the reward for successful innovation, is not exempt from competition. But we're not talking about competition in the form of price, although that's the way we see it. In the long run, no firm is immune from Schumpeter's force of creative destruction. In the 19th century, the canal owners in New England had a virtual monopoly on transportation. Roads were filled with ruts and frequently muddy, making the transportation of heavy bundles difficult. The canal owners made exorbitant profits. Land values along the canalways soared, but the introduction of the railroads effectively broke the monopoly of the canal owners. One technology displaced another. Technological innovation is presently challenging many existing regulations. For example, maybe it doesn't make sense to regulate local telephone service anymore. Current technology is such that other businesses can effectively compete. Some economists predict that the cost of making a cellular phone call will approximate that of a local call within just a few years. Schumpeter's point is that even monopolies are disciplined by market forces. But the discipline they receive, though, is removed from that of many smaller businesses. While not necessarily a monopoly, the very size of some businesses gives them an advantage that smaller businesses don't have, namely the opportunity to receive government bailouts. Government bailouts occur when the government provides financial credit or cash to an ailing business. Now, why would the government want to do that? Because the business's demise would catastrophically affect the economy. The number of businesses and workers that would be put out of work is so large that politicians intervene. In October of 1979, Chrysler sustained a quarterly loss of $460 million. Total losses up to that time were $721 million. Chrysler attributed its losses to government regulations, gas shortages, and the recession. Chrysler was the 11th largest corporation in America, employing 130,000 people directly, and 250,000 worked for Chrysler's suppliers. The cost of allowing Chrysler to fail were estimated at close to $3 billion in lost tax revenues, unemployment, and welfare. Chrysler's loss would also adversely affect the balance of payments. Wages paid to Chrysler workers and suppliers in the state of Michigan alone approximated $5 billion. Lee Iacocca, chairman of Chrysler at the time, said that the best thing that Congress could do to mitigate unemployment and help revive the cities was to provide Chrysler with necessary loans. Another form of government bailouts is in the form of import restrictions. In the 1970s, the U.S. steel industry had become antiquated, and management did virtually nothing to introduce new innovations. When threatened with foreign competition, the steel industry lobbied Congress to restrict imports. The cost of protecting the steel industry from 1978 to 1982 is estimated at about $4.35 billion. In 1984, the Fair Trade Act in steel was passed, establishing specific quotas for steel imports. The cost to the consumers was $18 billion in higher prices and welfare losses. Restraints on Japanese cars have for many years resulted in higher auto prices, in effect representing an implicit subsidy to American auto manufacturers. A third form of government bailouts lies in regulatory delays. For many years, America's automobile makers put off having to meet clean air standards. Their argument, meeting the standards would negatively affect profits, having devastating effects on the U.S. economy. In this segment, we've previewed the microeconomics behind government involvement in a free market. Antitrust legislation is designed to promote competition, and the goal of regulation is to curtail the power that large firms might have. Economists currently disagree about the extent to which the government should be present. There are convincing reasons for both more and for less involvement. In the next segments, we'll explore these arguments as we continue to examine the government's role in our economy.